Hi, this is Mrs. Gaffney with Patterns and Mechanisms of Evolution notes. I'm actually super sad that this is an online version of these notes because typically this is a day of like I talk little and then there's all these fun videos. So the videos are linked in here. I would highly recommend going to watch them. This first one really has nothing to do with the notes, but every time I have this slide, kids ask me what the heck is a gibbon. So um, ignore the four-wheeler. There we go. So if you're not sure what a gibbon is, go watch the video. It's really funny. It's this little gibbon picking on some tiger cubs, and it's just you know, it's for fun. So if you don't have time, don't go look at it. But if you're curious, it's a good one. Okay, so we're talking mechanisms and patterns of evolution. One way that this can happen that with patterns, as we're talking about, would be changes in allele frequency. So let's remember what alleles are. So way back when in genetics, alleles are you have a trait, but you have different versions of that trait. So you might say dominant recessive. I just realized you guys didn't have genetics. So in genetics, a trait can be dominant or recessive. There's different dominance patterns, so actually they can share. Like you might see a blended red, if you had red flowers and white flowers. If you got one of each of those, what we call alleles, or those letters that you see in those little guys on the screen there, if you had one of each, like this one here, we would call that heterozygous, or that you have one of each, and that, if it were incomplete, would show up as a pink flower, let's say. So it's not always dominant or recessive. You might have to go watch some Amoeba Sisters if you're more curious on that. They can explain that to you. But here we can see with the recessives in this first population, they're all blended in. And if this were complete dominance, let's just say that the little aliens, we'll call them aliens because they're A's. Let's say the little aliens are yellow if they have at least one dominant A, and they're still yellow if they have one dominant and one recessive, because this dominant will mask the recessive. So the only way you can get a blue alien is in this population 2 here. So you can see you have to have 2 recessive A's to be a blue alien. So even though we have the same amount of these recessive genes here, they're distributed differently in the population. So you can see different, what we call phenotypes, or ways that these aliens would look. So that's what a phenotype is. Think phenotype photograph, it's how they look. So genotype would be their letters. We don't see that per se, but what we see is a phenotype. So up here we'd have all yellow aliens, and down here we'd have 2 little blue aliens. And each that has these alleles has the ability to pass them on to their offspring. Okay, so one mechanism of evolution would be natural selection. We talked about that with Darwin already. Just the idea that whatever organism is like most fit for that environment is the one that survives and passes on its genetics. So it doesn't have to mean that it lives the longest. It just means that it has to live at least reproductive age. So an example of that in humans would be Huntington's disease, which typically doesn't develop until someone is in their 40s or so. So that person already has, had children if they had that opportunity in life, and passed on that gene. So even though Huntington's is detrimental, because that happened after reproductive years, it still gets passed on. But we're talking about nature in general, not humans, because humans are a little different. They're just different. We have technology. We kind of mess around with evolution. I mean, we're different than, let's say, a population of these beetles, right? So here we've got our nice little crow friend eating our bugs. And he really prefers the green tasty ones. They're the cream-filled ones from Lion King, if you ever saw that. So this bird will go and eat all of the green ones. Now, in nature, it's most likely that whatever these beetles are sitting on doesn't allow one of them to be hidden and the other one is, and the predators can see the one that's not hidden much better, so it's easier for them to find their food. So those get eaten and then the others stay. It doesn't always have to do with coloration either. There's different ways that they blend in or don't blend in and survive or not survive. So natural selection eventually can shift the population. Here you can see these beetles eventually turned all tan or this nice beige color. We have different types of natural selection. Now, if I were you taking notes in class, I would tell you that you should draw these graphs out because you will see, well, first of all, think of this as three separate graphs. And what we're looking at is the distribution of heights, let's say, of giraffes. You can see your nice little giraffe friend here. We're looking at the distribution of neck lengths there or heights with giraffes. So what this is saying is the very, very early ancestors. So in this case, it would be called a pre-okapi. It's what the giraffes descended from. Would have not necessarily a long neck, but we do see some variation in this population. So coming up your y-axis here would be number of individuals, and across the x-axis would be length of neck, let's say in feet, okay? So you can see here in this ancestral population, we have the average length of neck. So let's say this is 2 feet here in the middle. And what directional selection is eventually environment changes and longer necks become more beneficial. So when we're looking at the spread of the population with the neck lengths, we're seeing that, you know, maybe as the prairies are forming, like as that environment is changing, we've got the grasslands here. It's more beneficial for those giraffes with the longer necks to get to the leaves. And so those are the ones that survive and do well. And, you know, the others might survive, but let's say even just fighting against a mate, you know, if you're well fed, you're going to be stronger, you will win, right? Not fighting against a mate, fighting against a potential rival for a mate. There we go. They don't typically fight their mates. It's not nice. So this beneficial trait, the long neck, gets passed on to the babies because they win all the mates. And eventually what we see is our bell curve, which is what we call this in a graph, this pattern, is pushed over to one side. Now, it doesn't have to be to the larger extreme. It could be to the smaller extreme as well. It just depends on what that environment does for that population, you know, what traits are beneficial to survive in that environment. So directional selection means it's either pushed extreme to the right side or extreme to the left side. It could be either or. So ancestral population, current population. So we're seeing a shift in the bell curve. Stabilizing selection. This one, I usually talk about human birth weights with this one. So let's say if we go back into the 1600s, you might see, you know, still 15-pound babies try to be born, or let's say 2-pound babies or 3-pound babies still try to be born. Typically, those big babies, both mom and baby would die. I mean, that's a really, really hard delivery on the mother, and then, you know, not having the mother there for a milk source and whatever other complications, those genes wouldn't be passed on. So what we see over time with this is that the average size, so for our humans, somewhere around 7-pound babies, easiest, I shouldn't say easiest, but usually those deliveries go fairly well. There's not as many complications as if you had, you know, a smaller sized baby or a larger sized baby. The baby fatalities go down with the smaller sized babies. And you have to remember, I mean, pre-1900s, we didn't have things to keep preemies alive even, right? I mean, we had a friend born, well, a friend's baby born, where our friend could put his wedding ring over her foot because she was so tiny. I think she was, trying to remember how, I think she was 2 pounds, 4 ounces when she was born, just insanely tiny. That baby wouldn't have survived 100 years ago. So try to keep that in mind. Another example would be bird clutch size. That just means how many eggs are in their nest. We have an average size because if you don't have enough, you don't have some selection happening with which ones are the strongest and able to, you know, fight for the food from the parents. And if you have too many, that parent can't feed all of those young, so they starve. So we have this ideal size for birds, and it can vary with species of how many eggs they lay. so that you still get some selection happening with the strongest, and the parents are able to feed those that are the strongest and survive. Disruptive selection, this one's a fun one. So this is where we had directional selection earlier, where either one extreme or the other was beneficial. With disruptive selection, our bell curve is disrupted. So here's our original population, the ancestral population. And over time, you can see that both extremes become beneficial. So you did the peppered moth lab where you have this light variation and this dark variation, and that would be an example of disruptive selection. There's not really an in-between of those two. It's either white, with the birch marks there, or dark. Cuttlefish is another one. I would highly suggest watching this video just for the narrator's purposes because he cracks me up. It's pretty funny. But cuttlefish would be another example. So the larger males are able to fight off, other cuttlefish males. And the smaller males can pass off as females, so they sneak past the fighting males. They're clever like that. And then get to the females as the other males are fighting. So they sneak around them. So you get this split in how big of a cuttlefish is beneficial. Okay, so back to mechanisms of evolution. So our first one was natural selection. Our second one here is mutation. So mutations happen. You can get neutral mutations, so they have no impact on survival or reproduction. And you can have beneficial mutations. You can also have, non-beneficial mutations or harmful mutations. But typically, those are going to happen where they're not passed down from the parent per se. So, for example, we have a cousin whose baby was born, and he's been in the hospital on and off, and come to find out he has a mutation that wasn't from either one of his parents. It happened in just him, little Everett, and he's one of 20 people that have it in the entire world. And it's random chance. It's not anything that goes wrong. It just happens. So sometimes a species is lucky enough to get a beneficial mutation that helps their survival, increases their survival rates. And that's part of where we see evolution happening. And they're not something that you can just pick. We're playing around with that, right, with CRISPR and that, but I think we're quite a ways off from that. So keep that in mind too. A third mechanism of evolution would be gene flow or migration. So to migrate just means you're going to enter or leave a population. Emigrating, think exit. So they're losing alleles. So you can see these brown little beetles are joining these buff and cream colored guys over here. So they're losing whatever alleles this brown beetle was carrying. And immigration, think in, and typically immigrant is a word we're familiar with. We're coming into our country, so you're immigrating, and that population will gain those alleles. So this population over here without the dark alleles will gain this dark beetle and incorporate those genes into this gene pool. So that's a way we can have, variations enter the gene pool. We have migration. Another example of that would be the wolves and moose of Isle Royale, or really any island population. Once in a great while, an ice bridge will form where those animals can enter the mainland and leave the mainland. So you get a mix of genes that way. Or humans make that happen too. That will be the case sometimes. So humans might bring on new wolves to Isle Royale, where they studied the wolf and the moose population. It's kind of a cool little study. If you're interested, go check that out too. Genetic drift. This one might be my favorite video. It's a little Lego video, and it does a fantastic job of explaining bottleneck and founder effect. But just in case you don't watch it, genetic drift is random. So it's going to affect a small population size more so than a larger population. I'm from a small town called Thorpe, Wisconsin. So 1,300 people, and if none of those people ever left, if you have a mutation that happens in that population, it's going to spread quickly and that population will change. Versus if you have that happen in Minneapolis, We've got, I don't even know how many people are in Minneapolis, but a ridiculously larger amount than Thorpe, right? So it would take a little while for that mutation to spread. But Thorpe, you have less options, so it is what it is. A bottleneck would be so you've got this reduction in a population, and then founder effect comes in where whatever those individuals you're left with, those are the genes that are going to repopulate that population as it establishes itself. So an example of that would be narwhals, and they're not sure why, like where that reduction came from. They think maybe with the ice ages going through, something happened, but actually narwhals and cheetahs are another one have a very, very, very small amount of variation in their population, which means they recently went through a population bottleneck or a reduction of their population. And then all of those shared genes haven't had enough time to mutate because that takes a while. We're talking like thousands of years for mutations to happen where you see changes in a population. I mean, that's not typically a quick thing. So your founder effect would be then you've got your founder of the population, and those are the genes that are passed on. So I would highly suggest watching this video. Non-random mating, also called sexual selection, another one of my favorite videos. Watch this one and you'll have a little ditty stuck in your head and you can thank me for it later. I usually play it a couple times in class over and over so that it does get stuck in kids' heads. So you escaped that. You're welcome. But we have sexual selection. So I like to use the example of thinking about the animals that are in Minnesota. We've got, deer, fox, raccoon, not a lot of bright colors, maybe in some birds, but in most of our animals, we're pretty dull and camouflage, right? So if you compare that to the rainforest, I mean, typically when people think of the rainforest, you've got all these beautiful, brilliant colors and everything is lush and green and, you can have all of these colors in the animals. It's not just birds. I mean, colors are everywhere. So the difference there is that rainforest has basically an endless amount of food. So the predator pressure isn't as high as somewhere like Minnesota, where we've got some very harsh season changes. Well, deforestation for sure plays a part in that. But even if we didn't include that, those animals typically it's harder to survive here than it is in the rainforest. So in the rainforest, we see more novel mutations, as in, like if you ever go watch the Bird of Paradise dance, I didn't put a link for that, but you should go watch that. You don't see our birds doing that here. They've got all these, crazy hopping things. It's kind of scary, actually. I think if I was a female, I'd run the other direction. But they have the ability to choose what they want and not just who's going to keep me alive. So we see a difference with natural selection with that. Coevolution. So this is where you've got two species that push each other to evolve. Excuse me. An example of that would be our monarch butterflies and milkweed. So milkweed is very poisonous to other animals, but monarch butterflies, that's all they eat. And the coevolution that happens there is the butterflies will pollinate the milkweed, but then they'll lay their eggs close to it, if not on it. And the caterpillars will eat it and become toxic to birds. So they help each other with pollination and then keeping that species toxic so that they can survive. So there's a lot of that. If you think about how fast cheetahs can run, that's what I've got cheetah speed here. This is more just because the way cheetahs have evolved to get that speed is incredible. So their skeletons are shaped in a way that, they can run as fast as they can. I think it's up to 70 miles an hour, but they have to be able to catch their food on the savanna, right? Wide open space. So speed typically will evolve in those wide open spaces. So that's also a really neat one with the cheetahs to go take a look at. Predator prey would be another example. Think about, I was going to say lynx, but I have a feeling that some of you probably don't know what a lynx is. But if you don't, go look it up. Those are cool too. If you think about coyotes and rabbits, let's say, so they have to be fast to catch the rabbits, and the slower rabbits will get eaten. So the faster ones survive, pass on those genes, And on the flip side, the coyotes have to be fast enough to catch the rabbits. So the faster ones will get food, the others will not, and vice versa. So they push each other to evolve. Convergent evolution is where you have similar environments that cause traits to emerge, even though those species are not closely related. So sharks and dolphins would be an example. So they have that dorsal fin, and the advantage to the dorsal fin would be to help swim quickly in the water. It helps cut the water so that they move faster. Also, their coloration is very similar. I like to tell the story about when I was on the rowing team, and we were rowing in the canal in Florida in college, and we had a fin come up. And we've got a whole boat of Midwestern girls. So I went to college in Michigan, and we see this fin come up, and it just starts to follow our boat. And we have never rowed so fast in our lives to get back to the dock. We get back to the dock, we turn around, we look at our coach, and she is laughing so hard she can't talk. Because apparently it was a dolphin and not a shark, but whatever. We didn't know. She enjoyed watching us row quickly, but they look very, very, very similar. And that has to do with, you think about the coloration of the water, looking from below, if their prey were looking up, their light bellies blend in with the sky, so the lighter colors. And if you're looking down from above, their darker color blends in with, if you're looking down at the water, because it looks a little darker that way, so they blend in. But sharks are all cartilage and dolphins are mammals. They're very, very, very separate species. They're not closely related at all. But their environments have pushed them to develop these similar things. Divergent evolution is just the opposite. So that would be the pair word. So that's when you have a parent species and then you get two species off of that parent species. Now remember, when we say time, we're not talking like 100 years here. We're talking thousands of years, or something that all of a sudden isolates the population from the population it was a part of. And that environment is different from what their original one was. So then you have different genes that are beneficial in those environments, and you see those genes survive and pass on. Eventually, they get so far apart that they're not able to mate and make fertile offspring, and that's when you have a new species. So we call that speciation. Or divergent evolution, they're getting farther apart. So back to the giraffe example, we had the pre-okapi, and now we have the okapi and the giraffe. So different species, one on an island in Madagascar and one on the mainland in Africa. Adaptive radiation, this comes into play when you've got Darwin's finches. So if you remember back, he was studying the finches from the mainland versus the ones in the Galapagos, and we see different beaks there based on what they ate. So we have a single species and we have different species evolve from that based on what food sources are available, what predators are there to eat them or not eat them. Not many in the Galapagos for that matter, actually none. So more so the food source and sexual selection there. So rates of evolution, very, very slow. So even when we're talking about the mass extinctions, a mass extinction doesn't just happen in 5 years or 10 years. Mass extinction typically takes, it could take 1,000,000 years. It's not a sudden event. It's not like the comet hit the Earth and all of the dinosaurs died automatically. So this is something that can take a long time. So we're in another mass extinction right now, and they measure that by the extinction rates, like how fast animals are going extinct, and a couple other things in an equation that they have. So typically after that, we get life repopulating those areas, and that's where you're going to see changes happening and new species evolving. So it's based on a lot of different factors. Mutation rates, something could happen that causes the mutation rates to go crazy. Or again, a quick change in environment, and quick with evolution means, a couple thousand years, and 1,000,000 years could be quick. Lifespans of organisms, so mosquitoes are going to change a lot faster than let's say humans, because their lifespan is 2 weeks versus, somewhere between 70 to 100 years. They have a lot more babies than we do at once. So again, the ability to change is a lot faster for them because their lifespan is shorter. And environment really is the key factor here, because environment is what decides if something lives or dies. So we have two rates of speciation that we talk about in class, gradual, and that's like, you know, genetic drift would be involved with that. So not a lot of environmental changes per se, but you know, there's natural heating and cooling times of the earth, and they might go with that gradually as that happens, because that's also a very gradual thing. It's not something that just happens overnight. And then punctuated, we could see, let's say a volcano happened and split two pieces of land apart. Okay, well then we're going to see new species happen a lot quicker than this gradual graph over here. So what you're looking at is time going here. So as we go up, I mean, time is going, and then changes happening across the X. So you can see where they're spreading apart. And oops, sorry. One more thing about this. It isn't just one or the other. Both of these happen. Because at first they were trying to decide if one or the other was more prevalent. And it looks like it's a mix of both based on how the environment is, how the world is. Okay, so patterns of evolutionary change. These novel features are very infrequent. So like a narwhal horn, we don't just see that on horses, and we don't have unicorns, right? Like that was a random thing, and somehow that helped them survive, and so now it's there. So most changes are going to be modifications from what the ancestral species was, instead of like I said, wings and a horn on a unicorn. We don't just see that happen, right? So most of the evolution things we're not going to see in our lifetime. Those are things that are going to be built upon and change gradually as time goes. Overall is what we're talking about with this statement here, that organisms have increased in size and complexity. So when life first started, we had a single cell. And then eventually we have single-celled plants, right? These little cyanobacteria. And then over time, we see more complex animals happening. It doesn't mean that we don't still have simple organisms, because we do. And sometimes that's beneficial to be a simple organism. Bacteria would be an example. They're very, very simple. And because of their simplicity, they've been able to survive, you know, on and on and on. Jellyfish would be another example. So just because something is simple doesn't mean it hasn't evolved. It just means maybe that's what's worked best for it, because there's not a lot to go wrong with it, right? And then this last statement here, predation rates increase. So as predators are able to eat more of the prey, we're going to see better defenses in the prey, because the ones that survive and get away are going to be unique to the ones that don't. And then they pass on their genes. So it's that coevolution idea that we talked about earlier. And that's all I have for you today. So enjoy the videos and have a great night.